He has sent me to give sight to the blind and to release the oppressed people. Wow. I think for the Jews that were here, probably they were shouting right now, amen, amen. Because they were waiting for something like this for centuries. Always they were waiting for Messiah to release them from this oppression. And now when Jesus was in their midst and he read, probably they were amazed. Even, I think they were looking one to the other one saying, wait a minute, wow, this is what we were waiting. And remember that after Jesus spoke, he gave back the scroll and he said, today, this scripture is fulfilled.
As Christians, over the many generations since the origins of the Bible were first written, many of us have become a little bit removed from the very origins of the actual scripture. And as such, there is a lot of terminology which we no longer use. There's many who believe that we don't need to use this terminology anymore. There's many who practice what we call replacement theology. But when we look at our Old Testament, one of the challenges there is that, is it still relevant for us today? And if it is relevant for us today, then it is necessary for us to understand how it was given yesterday. So in this particular lesson, I'm going to explore what we call the Tanakh. So the Tanakh is the Hebrew word for what we know as our Christian Old Testament. The Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, is written in three different sections. The first section is known as the Torah, the second section is known as the Nevi'im, and the third section is known as the Ketuvim. Now, each of these three sections form what we know as the Tanakh. So the Tanakh is actually an acronym of the first Hebrew letter of each of the three Masoretic texts and their subdivisions. So Torah has the letters T-A, Nevi'im has the letters N-A, and Ketuvim has the letters K-H. When we put those together, we arrive at this acronym or this word that we know as the Tanakh. Now the Torah is known as teaching, the Nevi'im is known as the prophets, and Ketuvim is known as the writing. So we're going to explore what those three different contents are and how that looks in contrast with the Old Testament as we know it today. Beside me there's a table which shows the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. The significant thing here is that the actual books of the Bible do not differ at all. The difference is actually in the layout. So on the left-hand side closest to me, I have the layout for the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, and furthest away from me is the layout for the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. Now I've color-coded the different books of the Bible in order for you to have a look at this and to be able to more readily understand the differences in the layout between the two versions, if you will. So the Tanakh, as we mentioned earlier in the acronym, is actually made up of three significant components. The first component is the Torah, which is right there next to me highlighted in yellow, and it's known as the law or the teaching. The next category is called the Nevi'im, which is the prophets. Now the prophets is categorized into three different bands of color there. We've got the former prophets, we've got the latter prophets, which we call major, and then we have the latter prophets, which we call the 12 minor. Now in the Tanakh, the difference between the major and the minor prophets is actually not distinguished by whether they had a more significant role or not or whether they had more to say or not, or more to prophesy or not. In fact, it's as simple as the fact that in some of the books, they are considerably longer than those of the other ones. So the latter prophets, the major prophets, are actually the books which are the greatest in size. Those are the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. In the 12 minor prophets, these are actually combined in one in the Tanakh, and they form the books of Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and the last book of the Old Testament, as we know in the Christian Bible, is actually Malachi. But they're all grouped together there, and they're all there in the green colour. So the major prophets in the orange colour, and the minor prophets are there in the green colour. Now the former prophets above them are identified by the pink colour. And those particular prophets are actually Joshua, the book of Judges, the first and second books of Samuel, and the first and second books of Kings. In the Tanakh, there is some differences there, because the first and second book of Samuel, which are separated into two books in the Christian Bible, are in fact only in one book. So on the left there, if you look, you can see the word for Samuel, Shmuel, is actually only one. It's not there listed as 1 and 2 books. And the word for kings there, Melachim, is only listed as one again, and not listed as 1 and 2 books of kings as it is in the Christian Bible. So again, you can see there's an organisational difference in the books, but the actual content itself remains exactly the same. Going back to the Torah, those first 5 books of the Bible, they are exactly the same as the first 5 books of the Christian Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they all remain exactly the same. The Hebrew word that's there for them, they actually signify the actual meaning of those particular words. So the book of Genesis is known as Bereshith, which means in the beginning. The book of Exodus is known as Shemoth, and that means the names. The book of Leviticus is known as Vayikra, and that means and he called. The book of Numbers is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And the book of Deuteronomy is known as Devarim, which is the words. So once again, we have no difference between the two there in those first 5 books. In the Old Testament, the Bible, we call it the Pentateuch. Penta meaning 5, so that's a Greek word, and Tush means to teach. So Pentateuch simply means to teach or teaching, which is exactly the same as the Torah, which means the law or teaching. So again, the order of those books in that particular case are exactly the same. Now moving down, if you look lower down to the blue band there in the Ketuvim or the writings, the first 3 poetic books are Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, and they're all grouped together. Then we have what's called the 5 Miglot, or the 5 scrolls, and that comprises of the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And then we have what's categorized as other books. Now the other books are Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. The difference again is in the organization. In the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah are in fact combined together as one book. And the first and second book of Chronicles, which we know as in the Bible, it likewise is also connected as one book. So there's some significant differences in the organization. When you look at it across at the table for the Christian Bible there, you can see that after the first 5 books, we go into a very significantly different organizational structure. So in the organization of the next books after the first 5, we start to see the significant change between the layout in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. If you look at the color coding there, you can see that the book of Joshua and Judges, in fact, remains exactly the same for both, but it's from that point onwards that it begins to shift. Now, because the division in the Tanakh is different to the Old Testament, it actually affects the actual layout and how it's composed as a complete book. Now, in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, they've taken a different approach. So in the Tanakh, it's divided between the prophets, and as you can see there, the former, the major, and the minor, and then it's divided into the Ketuvim, the writings, which is then broken up into the poetic books, the 5 Megillot, and the other books. However, in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, it's actually been organized in order. So if we follow the Bible chronologically or historically, this is how the Christian Bible has actually been structured. So when you have a look at those books, we go from Joshua and Judges, and then the next book is actually the book of Ruth. So in the book of Ruth, which is part of the 5 scrolls in the Hebrew Bible, this is actually inserted between Judges and the first book of Samuel in the Christian Bible. And that's because Ruth, the story of Ruth, is actually during the time of Judges. So it makes a bit of sense, doesn't it, that it's actually been reorganized that way. We then pass through the time of Samuel and then into the time of King. So Samuel was the last judge before the time of King. So he was the one who anointed King Saul and King David subsequently. And so again, we find that order and the chronological aspect of the story of the Bible being fulfilled in the Christian Bible. After the story of the kings, they go into exile, into Babylonian exile, and this is when the books of Chronicles were actually written. So when we read the Bible, we see that the Chronicles, in fact, there's some minor differences between the content that's written between those of the books of Kings, and yet they talk about the same thing. And they realize the reason for that is because the books of Chronicles were actually written when they were in exile, and the book of Kings was actually written contemporary to the time when they were actually still in the land. So there is a few minor differences in the writing of the Bible, but it just shows you that one book isn't coerced or isn't managed to match up with the other books. They're in fact written by people at a different period of time, but about the same topic. From there, we have the story of Esther. So Esther follows Ezra and Nehemiah. So it's the Persian Empire that actually freed the Jews to return back to their land from Babylonian captivity. So we move into the time of the Persian Empire. And so the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are actually all set during that particular period of time. So once again, you can understand the chronological order with which they're actually placing these books. The other difference between the two of the Tanakh and the Old Testament, the Christian Bible, is because the books are actually combined in the Hebrew Bible where they're not in the Christian Bible. There's a difference in number in the total number of books. So in the Old Testament, there's 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, whereas there's 39 books that are actually in the Old Testament. So again, 24 in the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible, and there's 39 that are actually in the Christian Bible. So you can see it's actually been broken up into many more different components in order to, I guess, achieve this organisational difference between the two books. So going back to the organisation of the Old Testament, we start to see the insertion there of the book of Job, Psalm, and Proverbs. So this tells you something about the period of time in which they were actually written. Psalms, many of the Psalms are written during the time of King David, and also during the time of Solomon. So we've got Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs again from Solomon. Then we've got the prophets all following on Isaiah, Jeremiah. We have Lamentations inserted in there because that speaks about the time when those particular prophets were actually alive. So Lamentation talks of a lot of the atrocities that were actually happening, and it's a particularly a sad book or graphic book that's involved there. And then we go to Ezekiel, then we go to Daniel again, and then we go through all of the minor prophets. So once we get to the end of the series of books up until the Persian Empire with Esther, we go through this this book of all of these poetic books, and then we slide back into all of the prophets, which again fall into this order. So I hope that this helps you to understand the differences between the Tanakh and the Old Testament. Significantly, though, the books, the content of what's actually written in the books, always remains the same. Well, you may have heard of a phrase or a term called the Oral Torah or the Oral Law and be questioning, well, what exactly is that? What it actually means is the Torah that is on the mouth, and it represents those laws, statutes, and legal interpretations that were not recorded in the 5 books of Moses. So what is the 5 books of Moses then? If it's called the Torah, it's actually known as the Written Torah. So in Judaism, there is 2 forms of the Torah. There's the Written Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, and there's the Oral Torah, which is those laws, statutes, and legal interpretations that weren't recorded in those books. So they were laws, as I said, statutes and legal interpretations that were actually passed down outside of the written canon of Scripture. So they were known to be passed down generation to generation as part of the oral traditions of the Judaic people, and they've been organised into a written version today in order that those teachings or understandings are not lost. So I hope that that's fairly simple for you to understand. There is other terminologies in Judaism in terms of writings, which I'm not going to go into for this particular lesson. For the purpose of this particular lesson was just to open up that initial understanding of exactly what it is that we know as the differences between the Old Testament of the Christian Bible and the Tanakh, as we call it, the Hebrew Bible, and a short explanation on the differences between the oral and the written Torah. So I pray that's been a great help to you. I hope it's given you some insight and understanding. I hope it sort of allays some concerns because a lot of people think that what's written in Judaism is perhaps a bit different to that of the Christian faith, and in fact it's not. It's just an organisational difference between those particular books. So I thank you for joining me. Now, these videos, including this one and the many others that I produce, can be seen on my website. The addresses are there below me. So my website is thejesusmovement.com.au. Also, the trailers for each of these videos are placed onto my Facebook. That's on the address at the Jesus Movement Official, again there beneath me. And finally, you can view this full video on my YouTube channel, which is the Jesus Movement, and also type in Paul Brunton and that will bring you to the YouTube channel. Significantly though, at the end of this video, there is a trailer picture which I'll put up, which will have a picture of myself. Funnily enough, it's a picture of my face, and you press it like a button, and that's actually a subscribe button. So if you've enjoyed what I've been teaching you today, it would be wonderful if you could press the subscribe button. Subscribing increases the performance of my YouTube channel and allows it to be seen by a greater audience around the world, which serves the purpose of this ministry to teach the word of the Lord to as many people as possible. So thank you once again. My name is Pastor Paul. It's been a great pleasure.